It's a beautiful day outside, bright day, hard to bring people indoors, and yet we're living in dark times. I don't need to explain to people here why we're living in dark times, but this is a time where people are afraid to say things. I've been amazed to see visitors come from abroad now, afraid to come to America to speak out openly, in public, about a whole series of topics. And people are already scrubbing out of titles of courses that they're teaching for next year from their CVs, words like race, gender, climate, justice. All the words we should be dealing with all the time are being taken away because people are afraid to engage with them, which is quite unbelievable. And I think therefore it's crucial that in our time we do engage. I've been looking forward to this event for a long time, but I think it couldn't have been more timely to engage now with race. And yes, race in Ireland is an interesting question. It's taken it from a different angle. It'll open a whole series of questions, I'm hoping, from other directions, but it's important we engage with it exactly at the time where we're supposed to be keeping our heads below the radar. And with that in mind, we're very fortunate to have an excellent panel who will be introduced to you by an excellent chair. We have Lorelle Semley, Professor Lorelle Semley from the History Department, who's an historian who engages with these topics, who's engaged with these topics throughout her career, and is also the director of the AADS, the African Diaspora Studies program at this university. And I'm hoping this will begin or renew a long-standing cooperation between Irish Studies and AADS. Please, Lorelle, thank you.
Yes. Well, thank you very much for that introduction. And African Diaspora Studies is very excited to be in partnership with the Irish Studies program. And it is a pleasure and an honor to be able to moderate this discussion with this afternoon's panel. And it is amazing that you had 40 events. That is really, that's quite an achievement. I'm going to introduce everyone up front, and then they will give their presentations, and then we will open it up for discussion. So I will start with our first speaker. That will be Victor Pacheco. Victor Pacheco is a postdoctoral fellow at the University of São Paulo, where he also received his PhD in literature, specific literature. He recently completed a research internship at the University of Limerick in Ireland in 2022, and he has also been well supported in his research by the University of São Paulo as well, several different research fellowships. He is currently the editorial assistant for the Brazilian Journal of Irish Studies, and a lot of his work involves connecting Irish Studies organizations in Brazil to other international programs. And today he will be speaking on Black characters in contemporary Irish literature. Our second speaker will be Chanté Mouton Kinyon, who is an assistant professor of English at the University of Notre Dame. She examines transatlanticism and race through African American, Irish, and Caribbean contemporary literature and culture. She is particularly interested in cultural interaction at the intersection of literature and history. Her first book project is The Transatlantic Gesture, which is beautiful, actually, title. The Irish and African American Cultural Exchange. And it studies the symbiotic relationship between Irish and African American authors, particularly how these authors signify and conceptualize race and marginality. For 2025, she was awarded the Race AD Stuart Hall Foundation Fellowship at the Institute for Advanced Studies in the Humanities at the University of Edinburgh. And so she flew here from Edinburgh, and she's like still standing on her feet. And today she will be sharing work that will resonate very much here on Irish America and race in Boston. So that'll be interesting. Next, we will have Kimberly McLean DaCosta, who is Associate Professor of Sociology at New York University's Gallatin School of Individualized Study. Now, for several years, she has been a dean, and she was the founding member of NYU's Prison Education Program. She was also the author of the 2007 book, Making Multiracials, State, Family, and Market in the Redrawing of the Color Line, as well as articles on the commercialization of intimate life and the institutional production of racial boundaries. So she teaches a summer course in Dublin that explores the very long history of African and Irish diasporic connections. That course is called The Black and Green Atlantic, again, another fantastic title. And she'll be speaking on that today, but I think from the point of view of more recent trends, if I'm correct. And then last but not least, of course, we have Emma Dabiri. Yes, always put the accent where you least. Emma Dabiri. Emma Dabiri is an award-winning broadcaster and best-selling author of several books, including Don't Touch My Hair, What White People Can Do Next, and Disobedient Bodies. She spent over a decade as a teaching fellow in the African department at SOAS University of London. Many of us can't write bestsellers and then also teach. Just saying. She is also a contributing editor at ELLEUK and a columnist in The Guardian. She has presented numerous history, arts, and culture series on both TV and radio, including Journeys into Afrofuturism and Britain's Lost Masterpieces. She did give her a presentation yesterday evening, and she will revisit some of the parts of that presentation that she couldn't include on Dunegorm.
Yeah, the blue people.
Blueness, right?
Yeah.
Okay, and so I will turn it over to Victor, and I look forward to presentations and then questions.
So thank you, Lorelle, for your kind presentation and introduction. First, I'd like to thank the BC Boston College Art Studies for sponsoring the event, also the African Diaspora Studies. And I would also like to express my gratitude to Guy Banger for inviting me to this event, and also to Rachel and Maria. I don't see her in here, but I would like to thank them because they put up all this event. So I'm a little bit nervous. So my presentation is basically the result of my PhD research in the University of São Paulo and was financed by the São Paulo Research Foundation. So I prepared a presentation about 15 minutes and I will read, okay, so bear with me. I was talking to Emma yesterday and she asked me how I came with this idea to study Blackness, especially in contemporary fiction. And the idea came to me when I was in Ireland for the first time in 2019, and I visited the James Joyce Centre in Dublin, and there was this exhibition by the artist called Frank Healy, and he represented the James Joyce Dubliners in contemporary Ireland. And it caught my attention, the recreation of Evelyn, the third narrative of Joyce's collection, which foregrounds the issue of race in contemporary Ireland. While Evelyn is a white woman, Frank is a black man. I think most of you know the short story, so I don't need to go. So the employment of color in Keel's painting is essential because it defines the nature of the object. And the painting employs a color scheme comprising blue, green, and white, respectively representing the sky, the airplane, and ground. Additionally, explores the dialogue between red, orange, and yellow, as well blue, and presented in various shades. And the prevalence of this color symbolized instance of narrative suspense, while orange and yellow accentuate the characters or Evelyn immobility, indicating caution and vigilance. Blue directly references Argentina's flag, which was where Frank would go. The alignment of the objects, the plane, the security strip, and Frank's position in the painting centers the viewer's gaze on Evelyn, positioned on the left side. placing her as the main character in the narrative and the painting itself. In a post in Twitter, not X, the artist says that in my rework of James Joyce and Dubliners, the story Evelyn brought up to date and set in Dublin Airport. The life Frank has in store for them in Argentina is symbolized in his carry-on bag, but Eve holds on tightly to her empty bag, representing her life in Dublin. Consequently, while Frank's luggage dialogues with the sky, Eve's bag evokes the land. The emptiness of meaning represented by the white color that unites the ground, the bag, and Evelyn herself marks the absence of color, and as we know, a little bit of color theory, white contains all colors. Furthermore, the painting's integration of these elements facilitates a dialogue with the representation of Ireland as a woman, aligning nation, gender, and whiteness. Nevertheless, Frank is a visual paradox in the representation. The color of his skin and his clothes do not engage with the surrounding objects in the image. His body is displaced from the visual field, highlighting his departure for another country. If on the one hand, the image aligns Evelyn with the nation and whiteness, on the other hand, Frank is the foreign body that needs to leave in order to not disturb its alignment. Frank's blackness represents a definitive form of oddness that persists even when there is a significant structural change, such as the transposition to contemporary Ireland. A further analysis of the painting reveals that Evelyn's alignment on the left side of the image symbolized Ireland's alignment with the racial configuration of the West, confirming Irish position within the conceptions of and forms of power of the global North. In this sense, the representation reinforced not only racial positions that situate whiteness and blackness in opposition to one another, but also the suggestion that the presence of black people in Ireland is untenable. With this image in mind, I began to question the representation of blackness in Irish studies and Irish literature. Despite the seminal work of the historian William Hart claiming the existence of black people in Ireland dating from the 18th century, the idea of blackness is attached to the migratory influx during the period of the Celtic Tiger. It has become common sense to link black people to immigrants, and such a discourse, which is part of an anti-black and anti-immigration rhetoric, has been validated within the theoretical production of art studies. The critical body of work on art literature appears to focus on the relationship between author and work, from a homogenizing idea of the experience of the immigrant who occupies the place of other in society, with the formation of art identity as a privileged parameter of culture and literary analysis. And I don't have time to talk more about that, but I'm also interested how art studies kind of creates an idea of artness in itself, and how this is also related to the idea of blackness and whiteness within art literature and art studies. By adopting multiculturalism and interculturalism, literary criticism on the representation of immigrants employs the black experience as a generalization for the immigrant experience and largely ignores the issues in the presence of the black body, anti-black racism, and anti-blackness in art, literature, and society. Throughout my research, I was interested in the patterns of intelligibility and the affective process that form an idea of blackness. While there's an apparent inclination towards politically and socially engaged writing in art literature, affect has been a privileged side to cover racialized and anti-black experiences. I followed John Brannigan's lead, who argued that race is an affective agent in our culture, and the recent turn to affect in our studies, which continues post-structuralist practice of dismissifying and exposing systemic oppression and power formation. So affect, emotions, and feelings are ideological tools for the maintenance of white supremacy, since ideology is felt as much as expressed discursively. Thus, I sought to understand the relationship between racialized experiences and affective process through literary representations, performing a theoretical movement that merge together art studies, Black radical thought, and affect theory. I focus on affect, race, and representation because, as Sarah Ahmed argues, and I quote, "A fact does not reside in an object or sign, but is a fact of the circulation between objects and signs. Signs increase in affected value as an effect of the movement between signs. The more signs circulate, the more effective they become." And I think you can think about blackness in the same way. Blackness is the effect of representational process accumulated over time, define the possibilities of blackness and events from a constitutive relationship that depends on whiteness. And here I'm thinking about Fanon's over-determination. Such representational process function as a signifying chains and increase their meanings in affective mediated objects such as literature. Thus, literary texts are privileged sites where affect circulates and increases its affective value through literary form, plot, style, and genre. In my dissertation, I analyzed a range of literary texts representing the diverse stages of the Celtic Tiger and the subsequent gradual recovery of the Irish economy. Works by Irish writers such as Rodney Doyle, Sebastian Barry, Colin McCann, Emma Donoghue, and Malata Corey review a common positionality of blackness in Irish society. Yes, black characters, they all come from Africa and have experienced some form of violence or poverty that forced them to immigrate. And then they chose Ireland because of their shared colonial past or because of the Irish humanitarian campaigns in Africa. In Africa, they experienced some form of racist episode. Let me go to myself here. They meet a white Irish character who either helps them or imposes difficulties in their experience in society. Black characters have as destined either redemption through sacrifice or sacrifice without redemption, and these sacrifices are generally related to family formation. So in this structure of intelligibility, I note that there's a reaffirmation of an imperialist notion of Africa as an inhospitable continent, the convergence of blackness as a unique and exclusive characteristic of Africa, excluding the possibility of the black diaspora and hyphenated black identities. Ireland as a place of possible colonial historic overcoming, but the colonial past needs to resurface through analogies between black and Irish experience to reaffirm Irish exceptionalism, racist interpolation as individual phenomena, with the centralization of identity representation based on everyday and institutional races, and also the centrality of heteronormative standards and the anxiety of interracial relationships. Black characters in contemporary Irish literature are linked to humanist concepts, with empathy emerging as the primary affective factor that shapes race relations. By emphasizing emotions such as sympathy, empathy, pity, compassion, and altruism, the narratives circumvent onto epistemological concerns, presenting affective practice as a facade of racial equality, as if race is merely about the acceptance of black people in our society. When I examine the onto-epistemological issues, the narrative uses stereotypical image that challenges humanist perceptions. This implied that the racialized other was previously regarded as not fully human. Oh, it's okay. And there is a sovereign subject capable of affirming the other as fully human. The capacity to acknowledge the humanity of the other is also it also is formed by the recognition of their sentience, that is, the ability to feel, experience, think, and act. Following Calvin Warren's expression, human its effects are primarily evident in the case of immigrants and black migrants because they acknowledge the humanity of the other and prompt a moral evaluation. The aim is to encourage the use of narrative patterns patterns that you use that will result in the effective expression of emotion, confirming the humanity and emotional capacity of white characters and denying the possibility of reparation for the social situation faced by black characters. In this regard, the deployment of empathy and sentimentality is not intended to alter the underlying social dynamics or serve as a tool for the anti-racist struggle. Instead, it is employed to preserve the hegemonic notion of harshness based on whiteness. So to conclude, I'd like to turn again to Frank and Keely's painting, and to think that, to argue that the aim of representing black characters is not necessarily to narrate their life experiences and give them a distinctive individuality. Instead, it is to establish a framework within which anti-blackness persists unchallenged. Although the works feature black characters that illustrate the formation of the new Ireland, they become a means of cataloging blackness in order to delimit the black experience in advance. Black characters are constituted through the circulation of narratives and representations. Such narratives circulate effectively within the literary texts and provide an external coherence to the characters in a network of meanings that overdetermine and render them intelligible. So that's my reference. Thank you very much.
So thank you to Guy and to everyone here for coming. I appreciate the invitation. Thank you for having me. In the opening scene to Martin Scorsese's film, The Departed, a reel of the violence that dominated Boston between 1974 and 1976 runs while Frank Costello, played by Jack Nicholson, provides a voiceover.
I don't want to be a product of my environment. I want my environment to be a product of me.
We're gonna pause it so Rachel can turn the volume up. No, it's okay. The remote is just behind the television, so no one look at Rachel for a minute. Now we turn the volume up.
I don't want to be a product of my environment. I want my environment to be a product of me. Years ago, we had the church. That was only a way of saying we had each other.
But now, I don't know, it's a funny thing. It put hate in your heart.
The Knights of Columbus were real headbreakers, true guineas. They took over their piece of the city. 20 years after an Irishman couldn't get a fucking job, we had the presidency. May rest in peace. That's what the niggas don't realize. If I got one thing against the black chappies, it's this. No one gives a damn. You have to take it.
The Frank Costello character is loosely based on Joseph Whitey Bulger, who from the 1970s through the 1990s ran South Boston as a leader of the Winter Hill Gang. The gang, primarily active during that same period, was considered an Irish mob organization due to the fact that many of their members were of Irish American descent. So the we that Costello is referring to in that opening scene are the poor and working class members of Boston's Irish American community, South Boston specifically. His point is that the black chappies are expecting the government to facilitate their place in American society. This comment is also referencing how Whitey Bulger and many other white Irish Americans in South Boston felt about the 1974 court order to enforce racial integration in Boston's public schools. While legislation in the 1965 Racial Imbalance Act was meant to desegregate Massachusetts schools, By 1974, a court-ordered implementation plan was needed to counter Boston School Committee's refusal to follow the Board of Education's orders. Irregardless of the fact that W. Arthur Geraghty's busing plan meant students from Boston's most underprivileged neighborhoods would be bused to each other's schools, Boston's Irish American leaders, including Whitey's brother, William Boulder, and Louise Day Hicks, aggressively fought to maintain the segregated status quo of Boston's public schools through fierce and sometimes violent resistance to racial integration. In recent years, two artistic projects focused on the intersections and kinships Irish immigrants to the United States and Blacks had in 19th century America. Kia Cawthron's 2021 novel, Moon and the Mars, follows Theo as she traverses antebellum New York City and life between her two families. The novel opens, Mutt I am, Irish and the Black, Black and the Irish, colored, Celtic, County Kerry, African. While an orphan, Theo's Black father and Irish mother are dead at the beginning of the book, Theo considers herself lucky because she has two large and loving multi-generational families to care for her. Through Theo's life, the 600-page novel provides in meticulous detail on both Irish immigrant and free Black communities of 19th century America. And while Theo finds herself lucky at the beginning of the novel, by the end, she decides to leave New York City along with the rest of her Black family after the violence of the draft riots finally forces her to choose between living with her Black and Irish relatives. That is, of course, because the primary instigators of the 1863 draft riots in New York and Boston, which started the day after the New York City draft riots, were members of America's Irish American communities. Premiering on Broadway, April of 2022, Paradise Square focuses on bar and brothel owner Nellie O'Brien, who first loses her Irish American husband, Willie O'Brien, to the Civil War, and then loses her establishment to the violence of the draft riots. New York's draft riots remain one of the deadliest riots in American history and resulted in significantly diminishing Black representation in Manhattan, which had already been severely impacted by the razing of Seneca Village. The footage that we just saw, used in the department's opening scene, coupled with Costello's anachronistic statement, frames the status of Black and Irish American race relations by the mid-20th century. As illustrated in both Moon and the Mars and Paradise Square, prior to the 1863 moment, Irish immigrants and Black Americans had fellowship and community. Yet, 3 generations post-bellum, Irish Americans throughout America, and in Boston in particular, dominated the political landscape and bought into an understanding of racial hierarchies that position whites at the top of the spectrum. Moreover, not only is Costello's 20-year reference to time between Irish marginalization to America and when John F. Kennedy becomes president of the United States absolutely inaccurate, the statement is also misleading in understanding how Irish Americans built political strength in America. As James Baldwin writes in The Price of the Ticket, the Irish Middle Passage, for but one example, was as foul as my own, and as dishonorable as on the part of those responsible for it. But the Irish became white when they got here and began rising in the world, whereas I became Black and began sinking. So what is interesting to me and the work that I do is that the footage in the opening of the Departed and Costello's support of Southie resistance to school busing directly contradicts how the Irish in Northern Ireland were reacting to racial injustice in America at the same moment. For instance, the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association, the NICRA, formed in 1967, and other Northern Irish activists modeled their resistance to sectarian prejudice in the North after Black American civil rights activists and protests, including advocating for democratic voting practices and marching against gerrymandering that supported housing discrimination. Now, that's just a summary of some of the work that I'm doing. I'm a scholar of transatlanticism and race. I don't think I could beat that from my my profile, guys, so I won't be one of the people that is taking that part out. And as it was introduced, I study African American, Irish, and Caribbean literature. And so my book project is currently looking at how this intimacy between Blacks in America and Irish in Ireland, but that juxtaposition of how that relationship has been destroyed or ignored by the relationship between Black Americans and Irish Americans is also a part of the work that I do. Thank you.
Thank you, Chanté. That was really interesting. And Victor, I'm taking notes furiously. I want to follow up on. And like my predecessors, thank you all for having me here. It's a delight to be back in my birthplace, my hometown for at least part of my life. And that clip of The Departed depicts the most formative time of my life here. I was a young person during busing in Boston. As a child of a African American man, Irish American mother, and my 5 siblings and I lived that experience. And so it informs a lot of my interest in what I'll describe today, which is just thinking a bit about how it is that we might fruitfully think about the Black and Green Atlantic together, the legacy of the Irish diasporic movement, particularly to North America, and that of the African diaspora here. I once at a talk introducing a panel, I referred to myself as being part of, descended from people who came here on slave ships, but also coffin ships. And what can we learn from that transatlantic fruitful comparison? So for the last few years, I've been traveling to Dublin with students from NYU, enrolling in my class. This course explores the long-standing, complex relationship between the Irish and African diasporas. People of African and Irish descent have lived in close proximity for 4 centuries, a result of transatlantic migration, forced and otherwise, to especially North America and the Caribbean. In the last 2 decades, Ireland's become a site of that encounter. The booming Celtic Tiger economy of the 90s has transformed an immigrant society into an immigrant one. Sorry, I'm sure you all know this. As migrants from around the world have relocated or returned there, including a growing population of people of African descent. Amidst these changes, the country's grappling with new questions about what it means to be Irish, be it by way of birth, passport, ancestry, or culture. And I commented elsewhere about my personal interest in Ireland and its emerging local Black Irish generation, but let me just briefly say, it was really during the pandemic post-George Floyd when I first really became, at least visually connected to what young Black Irish people in Ireland were doing. They were organizing. They were expressing their experience of having grown up in Irish society in terms that sounded exactly like the way that me, my siblings, other mixed race people of my generation talked about our experience. And that really intrigued me, both because they had the courage to articulate it, but also because in some ways I had never seen a collective expression of Black Irishness. As an American, Irishness is seen in racial terms and ethnic terms, but under the umbrella of a national identity. So It's, as a Black and Irish American, native here, raised in its metropolitan era in the age of busing, I experienced an American version of Irishness that was just not capacious enough to include those of us also of African descent. Fully consistent with American racial logics at the time, anyone with Black blood, even one drop, could not be white, which by the time of my childhood, Irish Americans had long since become. The pervasiveness of one-drop ideology and its ruthless enforcement in American life so effectively denied interracial mixing that many people who descend from both Irish and African ancestors are not aware of it. Recent examples are, every time an American president is elected, they look for Irish ancestors. They did that for Obama, they did that for Michelle Obama, finding, of course, an Irish ancestor who had enslaved her great-great-great-grandmother. Or Muhammad Ali, who assumed that his Irish ancestry was the result of enslavement, only to find out later that his great-great-grandfather had married his formerly enslaved Black great-great-grandmother. So there are these stories about the long-term connections between Blacks and Irish that aren't well understood. They're forgotten, or the memory of them was never really established. Most recently, maybe some of you have seen the documentary that's going to come out about Lonnie Bunch, the Secretary of the Smithsonian. There's a film crew with him. They took him to Ireland. He went to the ancestral home of his ancestors. So there are these recovery projects trying to tell that story that most people, even those who are directly descended from these connections, don't know about. That's basically this silence and erasure around these connections, at least in the United States. To see a younger generation of Black people in Ireland claiming their Irishness augured something important about the possibilities of remaking not just relations between Irish and Black people, but those categories themselves. And so I see my role as a university professor who teaches about concepts of race in different societies as offering my mostly American students tools to dislodge the certainties about race, of what it is and what it means. And so to do this, we study race, the concept and its effects comparatively and historically, and in relation to other categories like ethnicity, nationality, religion, or caste, that likewise organize systems of stratification. Doing so makes it easier for students to see race as a form and tool of power rather than a natural fact, and racial inequality as inextricably linked to class inequality. And so my hope in this class is that in studying how in different times and places racial categories and their significance in organizing social life change, sometimes even for the better, my students will also see that the same is possible in their own time and place. Given its complex history as a post-colonial society forged and successful in partial break from British rule, and now undergoing rapid economic and ethnic change, contemporary Ireland is an ideal site to do this work. And Irish scholars are engaging some of the most pressing issues of our time in Irish institutions. What is required to create a multi-ethnic democracy? Can belonging that doesn't depend on sameness be made real? How do societies manage the ordeal of integration? So over the last 20 years, to give you a sense of the debates, if you're not familiar, and particularly in the social sciences, scholars have been asking similar questions, moving from a sense of optimism to much more tempered assessments of late. In the early 2000s, Martin McIngall was very optimistic that perhaps Ireland would navigate this challenge better than others have, particularly better than the US and the UK had. In 2002, he writes, "A defining feature of the modernization project in Ireland is the creation of a multi-ethnic, open and inclusive society that finds convergence with a dynamic global economy." By the mid-2000s, many Irish scholars were documenting the ways that was getting hard or not happening. Carmen Puling and Karen Cohane detail how these modernizing projects proceed and their effects in a globalizing cosmopolitan Ireland. Greater urbanization, secularization, liberalization brought greater wealth and also greater inequality and insecurity, a new multiculturalism, and also new forms of stratification, the export of local culture abroad, river dance, and the inevitable struggles over who has the right to perform and participate in or consume those cultural forms. Is anyone familiar with Morgan Bullock, the African-American young woman who, during the pandemic also, became well known for her TikTok videos doing Irish dancing. And she talked about the harassment she received as a Black woman daring to do this and being good at it. But she recently performed, when I was in Ireland last year, she was performing with Riverdance in Dublin in a long run, very interestingly. Anyway, by 2006, sociologist Lenton McVeigh published After Optimism, Ireland, Racism, and Globalization. By this point, the picture and the analysis of what was going on in Ireland with these changes was really dark. At that time, significant policy and legal changes like direct provision and the elimination of birthright citizenship had taken effect. And they actually argue Ireland has moved from being a racial state to a racist state. By 2012, the geographer Elisa Joy White, her book is excellent, Modernity, Freedom, and the African Diaspora, lays out quite in great detail how much the window of possibility has closed in Ireland. Her ethnographic research details the myriad ways that xenophobia, racial prejudice, and discrimination shaped the lives of African migrants in Dublin. Though progressive economically, at least in neoliberal terms, Elisa White argues that Ireland is simultaneously socially regressive, a condition that she dubs retro-global. Indeed, these sobering analyses of what's going on in Irish culture and society are in many ways familiar, again, as from an American point of view, in particular a Black Irish American point of view, looking in. And in some ways, they resonate with my initial response to seeing Black Irish young people tell their stories in ways that, again, were so familiar to my ear. But I'm really cautious about assuming too much similarity between Black Irish Americans' experience, either past or present, and mapping that onto the Black Irish experience in Ireland. The appearance of sameness in Black Irish experience arises from within specific historical national contexts, and we need to really be sensitive to that. So I just want to say a couple of things about what we might be looking out for. Very briefly, the reason it's tempting, we all know it's tempting to think of race in these universalistic terms, that Blackness means the same here as it does in Ireland, as it does in Latin America or the Caribbean. We know this is not true, but we tend to do it anyway. I think it's important to remember the Black Irish experience in the US versus Ireland is different in these particular ways. First of all, there are 40 million African Americans. That's more than the population of Canada, and approximately 31 million people who claim Irish ancestry. There are 4 million white Irish in the Republic of Ireland, and about 76,000 Black or Black Irish. While Irish Americans make up 9.5% of the US population, white Irish comprise 76.5% of the Republic of Ireland's population. African Americans constitute 12% of the US population, Blacks in Ireland only 1.5%. In the US, both groups, however, are mixed. That is, it's estimated that 75% of Irish Americans have non-Irish ancestors. And most African Americans have non-African ancestors. Because in the US, Irish identity is understood as ethnic and racial, white ethnics within a nation state, the term Black Irish principally refers to mixed race people here. In Ireland, Black Irish tends to refer to Irish citizens of African descent, and mixed race Irish people are designated as such and have a distinct history. Ireland does not have entrenched forms of racial domination, prejudice, discrimination, segregation, ghettoization, and violence that the US has had throughout its history. And this is really important for trying to tease apart what is happening in the two places with respect to the meanings assigned to Black Irishness. And we have a fundamentally different national self-understandings. The US, fraught though it has been, has a national mythos and self-understanding as a multiracial immigrant society. A melting pot or salad bowl, whatever metaphor you want to use. Ireland does not. And that is just what's being contested now. I didn't time myself, so I have a feeling I'm probably going over. And there's lots of ways to think about, and maybe we can talk about it in the chat, about how other scholars are trying to get their arms around what it means, particularly the mixed race Irish experience and the Black Irish experience in Ireland, which I'm sure Emma has something to say about. Okay, with that, I'm gonna leave it there. Which? Thank you so much for organizing this. It's been so fascinating and stimulating to listen to all of the previous presentations. I'm going to try and be responsive to them. I'm going to cover some of the material that I didn't get to talk about yesterday. But before I get into that, I would like to just respond to a few of the things that I heard. Victor, so that was really, really fascinating, and it actually just kind of like further galvanized me to finish my novel. Because I was just like, wow, the landscape is dire. So one of my characters is a Black Irish person. That's not incidentally, is a Black Irish person, but the character reproduces none of those tropes that you referenced. I think maybe the fact that it's a Black Irish person being written by a Black Irish person is what may be distinct there. Also, what you were saying was so relatable to this imperialist notion of Africa as an inhospitable continent and Africans as impoverished immigrants. I think one of the things that people found challenging about me kind of speaking up when I was like primary school child in Ireland was that some of the stuff that I was saying was contesting that notion of Africa, and people found that extremely threatening and challenging. I guess the image of Africa that was dominant was one that was constructed largely through the missionaries and through priests and nuns who'd been in Africa. And I think the perception of Africans and many Black people by extension was really determined by kind of like charities like Trócaire, and we would have these like Trócaire boxes that we would take home at Lent, and they'd have like malnourished babies on them, and they'd have like flies in their eyes, all of this kind of thing. And I remember, actually when I was in school, this is telling you how old I am, but also how enduring as well and kind of recent in a way these ideas have been in Ireland. But we would still, when I was in primary school, collect pennies for the Black babies. That was the description. And I remember coming back from a holiday in Nigeria, and my grandparents were really wealthy. My grandfather was a high court judge, Supreme Court judge in Nigeria. And I grew up in Rialto, which in the 1980s was like a very impoverished part of Dublin. So when I went to Nigeria, I actually experienced wealth that was like unprecedented in anything I'd seen in Ireland. And my grandparents, like, they had a chauffeur. I remember their car had like
electric windows, which I was just like losing my mind over at the time. But I came back from that trip and said to my teacher, when she was distributing when she mentioned the collection, the Penny for the Black Babies, I said, oh, I've just come back from Lagos, and like I was being driven around by a chauffeur. I got pulled out of class. Told to stop lying, admonished for the huge chip that I had on my shoulder, and her response to it was just like so enraged. It was like kind of the audacity of me to not just, well, I don't know if she believed that I was lying or not, but I think something that so explicitly challenged what the perception of Africans was not welcomed. Also, my grandparents had been in Ireland, my Nigerian grandparents had been in Ireland in the 1940s and 1950s, because my grandfather was studying law at Trinity. And they lived a very nice life. Like they lived in Rathgar, which is like a very kind of middle class area in Dublin. And my dad went to Rathgar Junior School, which is like a private school, where his siblings went as well. And I remember referencing to people that my grandparents had been in Ireland in the 1940s and 1950s, and people were just like, "Oh my God, it must have been your poor grandmother. It must have been terrible for her." Was she this expectation that she was there as some sort of labourer or cleaner or something like that? And I'm like, no, I think she had a lovely time actually. She was having quite a rarefied existence. And again, there just being no frame of reference for that, and I think often that kind of thing being met with hostility. So thank you for raising that and talking about how that notion of Black people is continuing to be reproduced in literature. I was hoping it was a relic of the past, but clearly not. I would like to kind of kick off what I was going to talk about by referencing the quote that you used, Chanté, from Baldwin. The Irish came to America and became white. I came to America and became Black. Yes, that is like such a great starting off point for what I want to go into. So when I wrote the book, What White People Can Do Next, in 2021, one of the things that I was challenging was my frustration actually with this historic moment, kind of unprecedented in our lifetimes, where race was, such a hot topic, was zeitgeist, was like so kind of high on the agenda, and everybody was talking about it. And I was just like, this would be the moment to challenge the reification of racial categories, and for us to understand the constructed nature of them. This was an idea that I had, the invention of the racial categories Black and white, was something that I had tried to kind of like pitch TV shows on. I had really been trying to kind of get into more mainstream conversations, and I was always told this is too niche. This is just too specialist kind of thing. There wasn't interest, and I was like, this is the moment, if any, that we can understand why those racial categories were invented, the ideological and economic, functions behind them, and the fact that they are not like biologically true and immutable categories. But what I was actually seeing instead was the kind of doubling down on the sanctity of racial categories and a continued reification of them in many of the conversations that were being had about white people and Black people. I found that extremely frustrating. So I wrote What White People Can Do Next. There were multiple things I was trying to do, but one of them was just to kind of bring to wider attention and audiences how those categories were invented in the early English colonies of the Caribbean and what would become the United States. And I have a real fascination in the overlap between periods in Black history and Irish history, and the invention of those racial categories is such a key moment actually in the overlap between Irish history and kind of West African diasporic history and Irish diasporic history. So I would just like to read a little bit from What White People Can Do Next, which I was going to yesterday, but my presentation was too long, so I stopped. Okay, obviously I had lost the place. Sorry, just one moment. Okay, yeah. So in Barbados, in the kind of 1650s, early 1660s, there were, so initially a lot of the labour being used in the early period of the colony of Barbados was indentured Irish labour, people that had often been sent there by Oliver Cromwell against their will. They weren't ever enslaved, but they were indentured labourers, and they were then in that environment working alongside kidnapped Africans who weren't at this point chattel slaves either in the very early period of the colony. That would come with the kind of invention of the racial categories very shortly afterwards. But in this early period, there were a number of uprisings. So you have the English landlords and the Scottish landlords. It's interesting that a lot of the landlords in Barbados were also Scottish, because there's this idea of the Scottish as being colonised by the English, but they also have a very active role. I see you nodding, because I know you're based in Edinburgh. They also had a very active role in the slave trade, and were often not just overseers, but actually landlords, landowners, plantation owners themselves. But in this period, those Irish, Scottish and English people wouldn't have had any sense of themselves as white people or sharing a kind of pan-ethnic identity that was categorized as white. And similarly, those Africans that were there wouldn't have seen themselves as sharing a kind of pan-ethnic identity as black people. So you have the Africans and the Irish who are working together on these plantations, a series of uprisings that happens, which is like very threatening to the status quo on the island, because combined there are more of them than there are of this kind of small lawmaker, land-owning elite class. And in 1661, these slave codes are introduced. So I'm just going to grab some water. These slave codes are introduced. One of the reasons it happens at that point is as a response to these uprisings. One of the things that those slave codes do is to basically bring in really brutal forms of punishment for people of African descent, but also to deny them any recourse to any kind of rights under the law. Whereas the Irish, in this kind of beginning of the idea of them being existing under this kind of like shared identity with the other Europeans on the island, are, as white people, now given kind of like rights and privileges that are denied to the people who will kind of become black people. And one of the things that achieves is creating, and one of the reasons it actually happened at that particular point in time, is to shut down those kind of, I guess, that class, those class coalitions that are emerging between Irish and African, and to change the legal status of black people to something that becomes, chattel slavery, rather than the relative degree of freedom that was experienced in the period just before. From Barbados, this idea really, flourishes, and we start to see the same slave codes, or very similar slave codes, emerging throughout the English colonies in what will become the United States. So I'm just going to describe a little bit there. Other English colonies soon followed suit. In 1670, Virginia was a pressure cooker, which in 1676 erupted, when Nathaniel Bacon, an Englishman, and bearer of multiple grudges against both the ruling elite and the native people towards whom he harboured a deep antipathy, started a rebellion. This was called Bacon's Rebellion, which saw a union of commoners, both Africans and, in the case of Virginia, rather than indentured Irish, it was actually more English people, but both Africans and English united in the fight against exploitation and unpaid labour, the excesses of the plantation elite and those governing the colony. With so many aggrieved people in the colony, it didn't prove hard to get recruits. While the rebellion was ultimately unsuccessful, the governors were terrified by the fact that this had happened and that there had been this union of commoners. Their economic interests were severely threatened by the revolt. Such outrage should never be allowed to occur again. And this relatively little known rebellion would have a long-lasting legacy. As unaware of it as most people are, we are all aware of its bequest, the promotion of the concept of white people in North America. As I mentioned, Barbados had pipped it to the post in the Caribbean a few years previously. But Theodore Allen, the author of the seminal The Invention of the White Race, writes that the response to the rebellion was the creation of a new social status. This status would become the birthright of all European people, all people with European ancestry in North America, although not people who had mixed European ancestry and African ancestry, obviously. Thus the one-drop rule kind of vibes. But all people that, visibly at least, had exclusively European ancestry in North America. And ultimately, and this is the idea, that then spread so successfully throughout the world. This white identity was designed to distinguish white people from enslaved Africans and to consolidate Europeans across class lines, all part of a system of capitalist agriculture based on chattel bond labour. Just as in colonial Barbados, where slave codes were announced following uprisings in which enslaved Africans and indentured Irish had united against English and Scottish landowners, Baker's Rebellion resulted in the Virginian slave codes of 1705. As Edmund Morgan writes, for those with eyes to see, there was an obvious lesson in the rebellion. Resentment of an alien race was more powerful than the resentment of an upper class. Virginians did not immediately grasp it, but it would sink in as time went on. Whites would know their place, and Negroes would bloody well know theirs. The Virginia Slave Code was integral to creating division between enslaved Africans and European labourers, while facilitating a fictive kinship between European elites and European workers. This new status of white was a powerful tool for pacifying discontented and impoverished Europeans in the 17th century. Indeed, the sense of superiority encoded into whiteness remains a very effective ruse to distract white people from the oppression that many of them experience keenly. Okay. So in my work, I'm really interested in who the Irish were before they were white. So we often think, we hear this idea they became white. Africans became black. People of African descent became black. But who were they before? There's a much longer history than that relatively short one. So because my work, my original background is based in African studies with a particular focus on the Yoruba, but the last kind of probably 10 years or so, I've been looking at kind of decolonial possibilities within Irish as well, and particularly in the Irish language. So one of the things that I'm fascinated by is the fact, so if you were at my talk yesterday, you would have seen this image, but the fact that in Ireland, going back, there's definitely references to it in the 17th century, but earlier than this invention of race that I'm talking about in Barbados, in 1706, 1707, a book about the flight of the Earls talks about Dinegurum and talks about people of African descent as Dinegurum as the blue people. And one of the reasons that there's various kind of theories put forward as to why people who became racialized as black were referred to as blue. Also to note, it's not the primary color blue. It's actually something, well, again, there's different interpretations, but I think the one that I like the most is that it's the iridescence that's created when light shines on a dark surface. And one of the kind of, I guess, articulations of that I often think of is this effect. But the reason that you didn't have a reference to people as black people was because of the negative connotations associated with the color black and the identification of black people, or the black man on Fear Dove as being Satan, as being the devil. And it's really interesting because when you start to see Africans being referred to as black in this kind of construction of racial categories, one of the reasons is because of the negative associations with the word black and the positive associations with the word white. Obviously, nobody has white skin or black skin, but because they already came with these attendant associations, it became, kind of easier to dehumanize people that came to be racialized as black. But the fact that there exists in the Irish language a way of describing people who became racialized as black that predates the kind of violent taxonomy and hierarchy of race is something to me that's really fascinating, and I feel has a lot of potential to be explored further, at least as a kind of metaphor or poetic rendering. So I will stop there.
So we have plenty of time for questions for the very different presentations. Yes?
I have so many questions. This is a really rich, thought-provoking panel, so thank you very much. I'm going to ask two quick questions. One is, people from Montserrat have a very strong Irish identity, and I'm just wondering if there are other places in the Caribbean where that's true, and if not, what's unique about Montserrat? And the second question is, what does the experience of travelers in Ireland teach us about race in Ireland?
I was just in Montserrat actually. So in Montserrat, you were talking about how the Scottish actually were a part of with the English of colonization of the Caribbean, and the Irish were as well, which is the result of Montserrat. And so what happens in the Leeward Islands is that after this process of indentured servitude, when the Irish began to buy their way out of their position, they become slave owners and slave masters as well. In Montserrat in particular, where there were a lot of Irish, and also, so they are second-class citizens in Montserrat. And so that's a part, it's interesting because it wasn't a fruitful land, but this was a place where the Irish were able to become slave owners in a large numbers, and also develop and have slaves. And so I think the year is 1768. I could be wrong, but I think the year is 1768, and there's a slave revolt. And what had happened is there was 5 slave owners, 5 lands with slaves on them. The slaves on that land had organized to have an uprising, and they were going to have the uprising on St. Patrick's Day. And that because their slave masters were going to be drunk or what have you. That was the supposition that we hear in stories. Somebody spilled beans. There's all these different ways of interpretation. Sometimes it's a maid, a white maid. Sometimes it's somebody, a black slave that worked in one of the houses. But someone spilled the beans. They find out, and then the next day, the 9 leaders of the rebellion are executed or hung. And so that's during the 70s, at a time when the Caribbean is starting to assert their identity. People in the Caribbean are starting to think about what it means to be Caribbean. Montserrat decides to honor that history and hold a festival honoring these 9 men that were executed on St. Patrick's Day. What ends up happening though, and it's really interesting, is that this identity, this way of thinking about Irishness as marginalized, gets coupled with the story of the uprising and slavery. And so in Montserrat, you have this like celebration that both celebrates Black marginality through Irishness, but also recognizing the fact that these 9 men were killed, were executed, were hung. And so it's this really interesting myth. So it's this amalgamation of histories.
Yeah, have you gone?
No, I just know people from Boston.
Okay, I was just there a few weeks ago.
Oh,
And what's an interesting part of that story though of Montserrat is that it's a deliberate attempt at nation building and building an economy. So you get the real emphasis on the public programming, in the 80s. For 2 reasons: to build a sense of national pride in Montserrat. They're very explicit about that, but also post volcano eruption, where everyone lived is now under many feet of ash. The rebuilding of the economy depends on this tourism, and so Irishness is a branding opportunity that distinguishes Montserrat from its neighbors, but also it definitely, absolutely has that duality of both. What I found interesting is I didn't learn a lot about 9 people who were hung,
It depends on when so I was there with Collins, my daughter, and so I didn't get to go to any events at night. So I was going to all the cultural, so it's interesting because over the 9 days, or 10 days, they have cultural events during the day. And then on St. Patrick's Day, there's this huge parade. And I remember looking, I was there on like St. Patrick's Day for the parade, and I was like, where do all these people come from? And because I didn't see it, because I didn't go out at night, I was only going to the day functions, to the organized functions.
Yeah, it's a great history, and I highly recommend it. But it's a wonderful example, though, of the transatlantic kind of
Complicated history.
Yeah.
Have you seen the documentary? I think it's just available on YouTube. That is like an RT documentary, like made in the 1980s, and it's about the kind of Irish presence in Montserrat, and it goes and interviews people of like some of them just look like kind of like elfellas from the West Coast, but they're like of Ireland, but they're also of African descent. And they are singing songs. They're singing like Irish songs and stuff. It's I can't remember what it's called, but if you Google like RT documentary Montserrat, it'll come up.
The president actually made that, the Irish president.
Yeah, Michael.
Yeah, Michael.
Yeah.
And your second question, I don't.
Just the experience of the travelers in Ireland and sort of majority attitudes toward this minority group. Does that tell us anything about race and racism?
I think it does if you get, if you recognize race to be an ideological formation that establishes boundaries through custom and law, often, of who has proprietary claim over the resources of that place. To the extent that travelers have been kept separate, and ideas about who they are as distinct peoples from the rest of the society, that's a racialization process. And now you see the same sort of mechanisms to right that also being put in place. Anti-discrimination law, formal recognition, all of these things.
One of the participants that I interview or dialogue with in my never-ending PhD is Irish traveller and Black, and I had never met anybody of that heritage before, and their testimony is really fascinating actually about some of the kind of tensions between the two.
Yes, please.
I also have 2 questions. Returning to the Caribbean for a second, Emma, I was wondering if you had read Jane Ohlmeyer's book from last year about making empire. So there's a section in one of the chapters, I just pulled it up, the Irish feared that they would ally with the enslaved Africans. And I think that, like, in Barbados, and I don't remember what the sources are for it, but I'm just really interested in this this fear of solidarity. I mean, especially in these places where, like, we often think of, like your case in Virginia, as like a really notable example, but I'm wondering just like about the possibilities for solidarity, especially in these earlier periods before the construction, what that really, if a further analysis of that or exploration of that allows possibilities for us to reconsider the history of the Caribbean in general. And then the second question is for Victor. In terms of these authors that you're spotlighting, what, like, do you know their own experiences with, like, interacting with Black Irish people? Because I'd be really interested, like, how their own experiences are informing their writing in such a, you know, clearly aligned way.
So I haven't read the book that you referenced.
Literally came out last year.
Okay. I'm not familiar with that. But I'm sorry. What was? Could you just summarize the question?
Yeah, just that people during the 17th century were terrified of the Irish indentured servants teaming up with the Black enslaved people, specifically in Barbados, because of the Irish propensity for rebellion. And just I'm wondering if kind of investigating these histories of the fears of solidarity allows us to think about like solidarity both historically and today.
Like 100%. So when I wrote What White People Can Do Next, the full title is From Allyship to Coalition. And I think those histories of solidarity and an understanding of that kind of architecture of race in terms of like a white race and a Black race, one of the motivating kind of imperatives behind its construction, behind its invention, is to foreclose and to shut down those kind of emergent moments because they are really threatening. And I thought that familiarizing people with that history and with those ideas would be a powerful tool for building coalition in kind of like current organizing moments. So rather than people seeing their struggles as atomized or even in competition with each other, which is actually really plays into the hands of power. The idea of building like mass movements through creating coalitions of people with shared interests. I think that knowing that history is a really powerful tool in being able to do that.
Thank you very much for your question. For some authors, I knew the background, especially Rod Doyle. He was friends with the journalist who created the first multicultural newspaper in Ireland called Metro Irian in the 2001, I think. That turned out bad, but yeah, there was this legal battle. Yeah, and then and the other authors like, for example, Colin McCann, who lives here in the United States, he likes this kind of mixed background. So what I was, when I grouped all these writers and looked at them, I saw them in their position as an ally rather than, as you critique in your book, rather than someone who wants to change society, but in the place of an ally, So in a liberal perspective rather than,
Well, I was just gonna add that I'm on the board of an organization called the African American Irish Diaspora Network, and Colin McCann comes to our events all the time. So there's an interesting, he's I don't know him beyond that, but it seems like he's trying to stay connected with these
I think he is interested. I had an opportunity to interview him once for an event on Project Dudley, but I also had an opportunity to interview Roddy Doyle. And when you were talking about your African grandparents, Emma, being in Ireland in the 1940s and 50s when I was asking Rabbi Doyle, I was like, you went to, Dublin, the University of Dublin. It's like, didn't you see Black students? Because he talks about like just all of a sudden, and that in the beginning of the short story collection, he talks about just all of a sudden in the Celtic Iron seeing all of these Black faces, and it was like you had to have seen African students in Ireland prior to that, and but it was almost as like either they weren't intermixing, I'm not sure, but there was this idea that all of a sudden in the 90s and the early 2000s, all of a sudden there's Black people, and what he writes.
Yeah, I actually think that's when the presence became visible, though, in a way that it just wasn't before. I think before it was more the odd person that was an anomaly. Like, I was the first Black person that many people had ever seen in their entire life because they told me. And
I'm sorry.
And they were really like excited, like thrilled, shocked, horrified. But I think it's plausible that he hadn't encountered many Black people. Yeah, I'm sure he'd seen a Black person, but like I think it's plausible that he hadn't encountered many.
Yes.
Oh, sorry, no, please.
My question's for Victor. I love your kind of framework that you set up, and I'm really interested in how you position a Corey in that framework. She's someone, I don't know if you've read like Post-Feminist Futures by Claire Bracken, but that book in particular really gestures towards her writing as kind of a gesture towards the future for like Irish literature and this new Irish thing. And I'm wondering, like, does she complicate your kind of framework at all, or are you kind of seeing her also as falling into this like ally versus like coalition?
Yeah, thank you for the question. And I didn't have time to explain the position of mulatto in my framework. But the thing is, when I use, especially when I studied affect in these narratives I was dealing with, what I tried to do is to understand how affect the role that affect play in these narratives. So white Irish writers use affect to mask racism. Mulatto Corey use affect to denounce anti-Blackness. So, and I kind of say in this way she complicates what I'm trying to do. But when you think about the character she's writing about, they are immigrants because of her background. They came to Ireland because of poverty. So in a certain way, she shares some similarities, but at the same time she complicates that, especially dealing with affect.
I actually just want to add something about writing as well and perceptions of Irish writers. So I feel like in Ireland, actually, me being an Irish writer is actually has been less complicated than in the UK, where I'm often not considered an Irish writer. I'm like a Black British writer. And it was interesting, Nisha Dolan, I remember, I think our first books came out the same year, and she was just like, why is Emma not being included in these, like she's being written about, but not being included with these in these lists of like female Irish writers. And yeah, she tweeted about it, which I thought was really interesting. And I was appreciative of, because I was like, oh, because I guess in the UK I don't fit the perception of what's Irish, despite like listening to me. So yeah.
It's funny that you say you're considered Black British, because I remember when Zadie Smith was published, and there was this huge thing about her, oh my gosh, she's a Black British writer. And so now, 20 years on, it's more normal for you to be a Black British writer than an Irish writer.
Yeah, I actually think there's kind of been like a backlash against me being categorized as a Black British writer, so it's not really being said anymore, but like initially. And then I also had loads of Irish people being like to me, oh my God, like you have to like reject that. And I'm just like, yeah, like I'm not Black British, but Black British is different to British. It's like a kind of a contested space. And people are still like, there's got British in the name.
Were there there more questions in the back? Yes, please.
Just one for me actually, and sorry, just about the Dina Gurma, which has always actually bothered me, why black people in Irish be referred to actually as blue people indeed. So this theory is my own, it's probably entirely cocky indeed. But
Great.
first of all, just recognising that, of course, that the taxonomy of colour is entirely culturally determined indeed, so that various cultures will have quite different perceptions of these things. And if I'm not mistaken, I think that there was an old poem actually by Adam Lawn about Columkill, that different translators, I think Frank O'Connor was one, gives it the title A Blue Eye Backwards, and the other gives it A Green Eye Backwards. And blue and green, anyway, are certainly two colours that are not clearly differentiated. That's not my point. My point might be this one actually, but it's not entirely this either, and that is you're absolutely right, I think, about how little interaction there was between the Irish and black people over the centuries for obvious reasons.
More than we might think.
I think absolutely there must be, but it seems to me, in fact, and just as an example, however, of how little there is, I'm thinking of Maurice Sullivan's Philipino Foss, published I think around about 1930, and he remembers his father, if not his grandfather, at very most actually, saying that when a ship went down and these black men came from the ship and says that had caused absolute consternation. Aren't you the head of a chicken? Have you got the skull of a chicken? One of them says that you can imagine that God made people that kind of colour. So they absolutely refused to do it for a start. Now then they came to the conclusion, in fact, that these people had been working down in the boilers and they were covered in such. That's as Maurice Sullivan tells the story. But again, that's not my point. Here's my point: is that what is the most likely place in which the Irish and Africans would have met? Well, of course, it's the North Africa. And what's his name? Who made that film Atlantis? Actually talks about this. Bob Quinn actually talks about this, of course. And the people, of course, who was coming there, and we know that there was huge interaction between them, and that they were the Berbers. And the Berbers of North Africa, of course, are these indigo people. They wear these magnificent blue and robes with a blue hood to cover them against the sun or whatever else. And the fine blue powder that actually produces this indigo and the coloration of the clothes gets onto their faces. So if one were to walk in here today, you might actually think that the man in fact was blue. There's my suggestion, maybe nonsense, but you can try it.
No, that's one of the suggestions. That's, like I said, there's different interpretations of the sunlight, the iridescence on the dark surface is just my personal favourite. But I have heard that one before as well. It's one of the kind of commonly suggested ones. There's also references to Vikings bringing people from Africa to Ireland many thousands of years ago. And there is also documentation of there being a population of black, specifically men, in Dublin in figures that numbered into the thousands in the 1800s that were servants of wealthy people. This is still during slavery, but they wouldn't have been enslaved in Ireland, but they would have been the servants of wealthy people. And because they were primarily male, and there wasn't because they were primarily male, they actually just assimilated into the Irish population. And so there's probably quite a lot of people in Ireland that have African descent through those men that they are unaware of. But I would sometimes look at people growing up and be like, yeah, you're one of those.
Could I respond to that, actually? Could I respond to that from my own research? That's part of the common history of Europe, right? That common story in Europe, across Europe, is suddenly after, let's say, World War II or after the 60s, or sometimes after even later, suddenly there were black people in France, suddenly there were black people in England, suddenly there were black people in Spain and Portugal, which is really ridiculous. But if you actually look at documentation, you can see that, and it is precisely in that 1700s period that people are traveling on ships because they're traveling with enslavers to work. It would seem to me to be so strange when you have thousands of people in the UK who traveled with enslavers to the UK that there could be none.
Yes, and Dublin was the second city of the British Empire at that time, or England at the time.
But I don't know, yeah. Well, and of course, Equiano, who goes to Montserrat, also goes to Ireland. Yeah, so, yeah. Yeah.
Rather simplistic question. Many white people historically have seen something that they believe they've discovered. Even, you know, like Columbus and discovering a whole continent where people already lived. Early on in the 1980s, Black Irish referred to Irish people that had black hair, dark. And I'm curious how the sort of the metamorphosis of being able to say Black Irish is now African American, African-based, Black Irish, and what the other Spanish, perhaps based Black Irish think about that. Because I'm just curious.
Yeah, Black Irish in the way that you're describing it was never something I encountered growing up in Ireland. I only heard of it like through American people, and I had it described to me as it being in reference to people with like dark hair or like white but with like a darker complexion. And I think it was like probably like quite uncontested because there weren't many Black Irish people like myself in significant numbers. But as that has become, you know, more of a sizable demographic, I think yeah, the meaning of that has obviously, you know, shifted.
People talked about it in Boston, people I know, family and so on, that always talk about the Spanish Armada.
Yeah. Yeah, over here, yeah.
I just have
and then you'll
a couple of points like John, 2 points. One is that the British Empire certainly is important in terms of Irish people who joined the British Army or were dragooned into the British Army and then went to work in the Empire. And there's a beautiful song by Ry Cooder and others called The Coast of Malabar, which talks about an Irishman falling in love with an Indian person. So the subcontinental aspect of this can also be relevant, not only African. So that's first point. The other point, of course, is that for those of us with a particular interest in popular culture, Phil Lynott and Thin Lizzy was the epitome of the problem as it suddenly emerged in the 70s. I'm Australian, and Thin Lizzy had a hit like they did around the world in the 70s, and the first question that everybody asked is, what is a black singer, guitarist doing in a band from Ireland? And that was the first recognition, at least at the popular level, of blackness and of the African influence in Ireland. And maybe we should look more at popular culture as part of this challenge as well.
I'm writing, my next book has a chapter on Phil Lynott. I'm really like fascinated by him. I see him as belonging to, even though he's like the generation like before me, I see his experience and mine as far more similar to the people who've been born from the mid-90s onwards. I think similarly to me, he's kind of like an anomaly to some degree in Ireland. He would have been, you know, in the same way that I was. Yeah, so not to say there were none of us, but we were very few in number.
And I borrow him for my own uses. For the same reason.
My question is for Chanté. It's about the two texts that you introduced us to, The Moon and Mars and also Paradise Square. I was wondering if there are any things you see as like resonating between the two in terms of something that they like, how they talk to each other in terms of like what they're doing artistically or literarily, but also what might be unique about Paradise Square in terms of it being like a staged production and having that like performative aspect to it.
Did anyone see it?
My show got canceled.
Because of the pandemic?
Yeah.
Moon and Mars is beautiful. Has anyone read it?
I told you my course.
Because of you. I bought a lot of copies and I gave them all out. Moon and Mars is a beautiful, beautifully written novel. Kia is a dramatist, primarily, and so this was her second novel, and she really focuses on language and speech, and so we follow the character Theo. She's talking to the reader throughout the text from 1857 to I think 1894 or something like that. 1880, something like that. A few years after the Civil War, and I think what's interesting about the novel is also a lot of the criticism that it received is it's a teaching moment. It really focuses on this history of New York City. Theo is privileged to every significant event that happens between those years. So it starts off in Seneca Village, which is, for those of you who don't know, Seneca Village was a space that free blacks had settled on, and which would have been right across the street from the Upper East Side, and it was raised in favor of Central Park. Some people were reimbursed for their land, a lot weren't. And it was actually forgotten. It was lost into history until I think a few years ago when people started going, what's this place that used to be here? And then it was discovered or rediscovered. So Kia's book really focuses on this history of New York City and of Black New York City, which had ultimately disappeared in Manhattan after the draft riots. Paradise Square is a Broadway production, and it takes one moment and then turns it into a Broadway production. So it's kind of problematic. It's tried to do a lot of things. What was interesting about it, and I think what's interesting about the fact that, while I focused today, or I talked about today in this scene in The Departed, it was this disruption between this story between Irish and Black authors and Black and Irish creative projects. And so Moon and Mars is written by a Black American woman. Paradise Square is written by an Irish man, Larry Curran. What I focus on is this way that artists have Black artists and Irish artists have been talking to each other through literature, right? And I started in the 20th century. I started with the Irish and Harlem Renaissance, and I moved through the 20th century where there's these moments of actual interaction between the artists. The interesting thing about what was happening in Boston in the 60s is that politically, that relationship couldn't be sustained. It wasn't sustained. And so those two projects are interesting because they're talking about that same moment, that first moment where politically that relationship is demolished, right? They both start in 5 Points, New York, where these families, and through Theo, we see these families participating and loving each other. But the first disruption happens because her father can't be buried with her mother because her mother's in one graveyard, and when her father dies, he can't be buried. And that's the first disruption that happens between their families. So it's this interesting story of, on the individual level, where Black Americans and Irish people can connect, and that happens in both Paradise Square and Moon and Mars, but also through the work I do. They're connecting, and it's usually through art, and it's still happening. That's the interesting part for me. We're 20 years into the new century, and this is something that's still happening. You don't have this idea of Black Irishness anymore, where you're I'm Black Irish because I have dark hair and blue eyes, but you still have this understanding of this connection between the two groups. So it's the Moon and Mars is really good. It's 600 pages, but it's beautiful.
I have a confession. So my first personal encounter with racism of this sort in Ireland, I arrived as a student in Ireland, and as today, there was a housing crisis in Dublin, and I was desperately looking for accommodation in the area of UCD. And I was cycling around to any place there was an ad, and I'd arrived there, there'd be 20 people ahead of me, and I was there to hear no. And then I cycled up to Dundrum, and there was this little old lady, very nice Irish lady, who had this bed sit upstairs. And it was a sign of its time. This was already the late 90s, but she was from an earlier generation. And she had all these rules. Well, you can't bring in any female companions, and there's a curfew, and there's and the more she outlined the rules, I realized I don't want to live in that place. And I was saying thank you. It was the one time I was ahead of everybody. I was the first person there. And I was about to leave, and she takes me aside, and she kind of felt that I said, I'll get back to you. She realized that I was going to say no. And she said, if you have any other people that you know, please tell them I love international students. She realized I'm not Irish, but not any dark ones. I remember saying that. And I remember my answer at the time, because maybe then I was still sharp-witted. I told her, but I'm colorblind. And I remember her answer, which was so Irish, she said, "Oh, poor you." But I just remember that it came back to me during this talk, like 20-something years later, it hit me now. But it was there, it was under the purpose. It was as if she wasn't trying to insult anybody, but it was there, very clearly. And that came back to me. The question I wanted to ask is inspired by Emma, and I'm directing to the others, because I think Emma's already worked this through. Maybe Emma would like to come in back as well. Emma has challenged us to engage in de-racialization, right? I mean, all of you have, also Kim has as well, in terms of saying race is a construct. We can see when it's constructed historically. Now the challenge is to de-racialize in many ways. But we're also aware from other studies that constructs are powerful realities. They're not imaginaries, right? You know, as a student, all of my teachers in poli-sci would tell me that nations are constructed categories. So what? Nations didn't disappear, poof, because of that. And the biggest challenge, and I know that this I got from reading Emma before that, and she's mentioned it here as well, is that people are invested in these categories, but not only the racists, right? Also the people who are countering racism, that's Emma's critique of liberalism, are invested in these categories because it's identity categories. So where does it fall into, I'm wondering also the other commentators here on the panel, where do you engage with this notion where you're challenging racialization, and yet deracialization is not wanted by certain people, or it's undermining people?
It's a simple question. Really easy answer.
I actually think, can I grab this for a second? Thank you. Thanks. Yeah, I'm in no way I don't know if this is working. I'm in no way suggesting that race, like this kind of like post-racial like kind of transcendence of race, and that race isn't without serious material, historic, economic, consequences. But I think at the very least, we need to have a familiarity with the constructed nature of it. And I feel that many people actually, it's not even that they're just obviously people are invested in it, but it goes beyond people just being invested in it, in them genuinely believing in the truth of it. They are not, as I was saying yesterday, of course there have always been people, with different skin colors, different hair textures, different phenotypes, different facial features, all of different features, all of this stuff. But the idea that those things have any intrinsic value that translates into our contemporary notions of kind of whiteness and blackness, which is obviously there's other races, quote unquote, but that's kind of what I focus on. I think there's a lack of awareness that there are other ways of thinking about things, and that there was, from most of the history of humanity, those different features not having any intrinsic value. I think if people have a familiarity with that, it helps them think more creatively, or helps them think kind of beyond the immutability of those categories. So I'm not saying it's we're trying to completely dispense with them, but we should at least have a working familiarity with the constructed nature of them and the reasons that they were invented.
I would add to that. I would add to that people might claim most people aren't as invested in race per se as it would appear, except for the most extreme. They're invested in culture.
Yeah.
They're invested in a sense of history, memory, ancestry, belonging, and to the extent that gets railroaded along these racial lines, that just becomes the cheap substitute, or the shorthand by which we can assure ourselves that we will have some continuity. Most of what I do in my research is about interracial families and the difficulties people have with that, or the imagination of, this is going to solve all our problems socially if we intermarry. And what tends to stand out when you talk to these families, particularly families who are new to this, I'm from an intergenerational now at this point, interracial family. But when I talk to people who are maybe about to get married, or are concerned that their children are about to get married, it's on the one hand shocking to me, because I'm like, how can you be so concerned about this? And on the other hand, if knowing everything I know about this person, what they're really telling me is, I'm afraid of losing something. I'm afraid of cultural loss. I'm afraid of everything else is shifting around me, and I don't want to lose this. I want to see it in my grandchildren. Culture, the traditions. That's what people care about.
And just to add quickly to that, so that's why I don't see myself as like half white or half black. In fact, I see myself as Irish and Yoruba. And I think because I write about what you talk about, it is like culture and inheritance and memory and tradition. And the fact that I have both doesn't, I feel, dilute either. You know, I just have these two lineages. So I think once you kind of move beyond, because I'm very much like identifying as Yoruba and as Irish, which is very different to identifying as half white and half black.
I was thinking about this earlier from your question, Rowan. I was thinking about Paul Gilroy's book Against Race. Race is a fiction, it's a construct, but it's also a fact. And so how do you work, how do you talk about it, how do you think about race within this space of it being completely false and true at the same time, and how do you interact with it? And so much of why we lean into our ideas about race are both the history and the culture of what has happened to get us to this point. So I was thinking about your numbers on the amount of Irish people or the people that claim Irishness, or how do we talk about African American? Well, are those numbers real? Because almost every single black person in America has European ancestry. And the people that are claiming Irishness, please, right? Because it's only because Irishness became cool. There was this moment where it became cool to be, it no longer, the interesting thing about what the Costello character says is that there becomes a moment in America where being Catholic is okay, and then obviously, now I have to be Irish Catholic. And so there's this switch in the identity. So, I think about Against Race because Paul Gilroy has this section in there about the gap, about Joseph Goebbels and the gap, and talking about basically the effectiveness of what Goebbels did was the marketing. And so we market race, we market these ideas about race. And so that line between fact and fiction has so much to do with history, but also marketing, right? And blackness, what does it mean to be black? This history of European ancestry, that isn't necessarily visible in every black American as well. And so talking about our history and talking about our identity is really complicated. Because of course I don't want to deal with race anymore. Of course I don't want to acknowledge it. But at the same time, what does that mean? And then there's so many students now who are biracial, who call themselves biracial, but then there's a generation of black professors that they've encountered that are offended by that don't understand why they are accepting this new duality of identity.
But I think what's really interesting about blackness is that it accommodates plurality, and so you can be black and be something else as well. And I actually really contest mixed race and biracial as terms because of the way they reinforce this pseudoscience around race. I understand why people use those terms, but I think if there was more understanding around the constructive nature of race, they would probably be more hesitant to. So I would identify as black as opposed to mixed race, biracial. But that's generational as well.
But the professor that one professor, in fact, he was so upset that students of his, so they were probably born in the late 90s, early 2000s, were referring to themselves as biracial. He's like from black to white and you know, and damn near white. That like he didn't understand that. So that plurality of blackness that included everybody, he didn't understand why they didn't just see themselves as black, but their identity is multifaceted, I think.
That phenomenon of blackness is that so broad to encompass damn near white, etc. That's an outcome of segregation. That's an outcome of Jim Crow and slavery.
Yeah.
They don't live that life anymore. I mean, there's a kind of profound shift here, particularly. I mean, it gets codified, at least in official statistics, in the year 2000. Right? That's when the census began allowing, checking multiple boxes and counting them and using them throughout the bureaucratic apparatus. This generation doesn't live that life that my generation did. So there's a reason they use the terms.
So I understand why you're rejecting it, but for instance, my daughter, I don't know. When she was born, I actually put black, and then I started listening to her, and I was like, I don't think that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah. Okay, last question.
You actually, this young lady had a question.
I can ask her.
Oh,
I'm here. So, okay, so I'll be quick. I've been thinking about trying to sneak in How to Talk About Sinners, the film, and pop culture without the spoilers and without being silly, but I'll be really quick. So basically what made me uncomfortable, what I'm seeing, so like how the relationship between Black culture, specifically so like dance, music, popular culture, and Irish culture is being depicted as like these fantasies of solidarity, right? And then they like these small potentials of exchange and collaboration, and then it all ends in like appropriation and literal like sort of vampiric exploitation. Like that's the Black Irishness you get, right, in particular scenes. And it left kind of sad, and I was just like, well, is there a world or an imagining in which sort of like the exchange or the encounter doesn't end in some kind of exploitation, right? Is this like ever not a part of that formulation, especially if we want us to like put these two things together, right? And we're trying to facilitate, right, some of that sort of like, again, cultural like plurality, exchange, production, like how does that actually work? Is there a world in which that's sort of like that's not part of the equation, the appropriation part of it?
I mean, historically, no. Right? I think like for the artists that I study, they have all tried. For instance, when I gave the talk on this film called Uptight, which is a remaking of John Ford's The Informer, the way, and so with an all Black cast, the way that film was rejected by the American public, and especially the white American public, it just was like this, how dare they sully the story of noble Irish freedom fighters with the Black revolutionaries. No. So historically, no, right? Their individuals have tried to say, yes, there's this solidarity, there's this commonality that we can celebrate. But historically, that's been rejected by the public and by the masses.
I just heard about this. Put it in my phone.
I also think, just to add, the relationship between Black people and Irish people in England is like so interesting because it's quite distinct from how it is in the States.
Well, that was kind of going to be where my question was going to go.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah, so that's really useful. Thanks for really interesting and thought-provoking contributions from everybody. And my question was kind of about responding to your point earlier, Robin, about do we need to disaggregate some of these categories, and is this phrase of New Irish actually useful, or is it kind of flattening out what are very different and distinct experiences, whether it's from different cultural or ethnic backgrounds or different diasporic backgrounds and sites of encounter and histories there. So I was just wondering how useful you as a panel find the term New Irish in your work.
I think it's useful, but limited. It's useful to the extent that it points you to what it can't describe or might obscure. And Phil Mullen, who's a sociologist at Trinity, has written about this a lot. Because the New Irish, insofar as it references African migrants to Ireland, erases this the history of mixed race Irish who have long been, especially since mid-20th century on, a part of Irish society, even though marginalized. Largely, she writes have you read those stuff?
No, I was nodding in agreement.
Yeah. So she talks about the incarceration of mixed race Irish in institutions, an experience out of which she comes, and that there is a problematic rendering of the New Irish as Black people just got to Ireland. She's like, no, we've been here, but we have been marginalized in real serious ways. And cultural memory of mixed race Irish has never been established. But we exist.
Yeah, I love that because I started being called New Irish and I was like, would you fuck off?
Right.
There's nothing new. There's nothing new about me, do you know what I mean? Like my Irish heritage is going back bloody millennia, and so I love that, that because my personal experience maps on completely to what you were saying. So I think there is an erasure. Again, I resist describing myself as mixed race Irish because I'm Irish, and I'm also Black. But I'm Irish and I'm Black. So
yeah, I don't use New Irish at all in my research because I also think that it's dismissive and erase people like Emma, existence. And also, it's kind of trained word in Irish studies. A trendy word, the New Irish. So everything that's new, it's interesting. So to write about. So I think sometimes we use some vocabulary just because it's new and fresh and don't think about why we're using that. So that's the reason why I don't use it at all, and I try to go against it. Sorry.
I haven't really thought about it, but I'm thinking about the point that Kim just brought up, especially when I was thinking about Rodney Dola. There have been Black people on the island, historically. It didn't just happen in the 90s and the early 2000s. It didn't just happen with the Celtic Tiger. So I guess from that perspective, thinking about the New Ireland, just taking it out of the ghetto, or taking it out of that imprisoned situation and making it part of the conversation. Like this is a marginalized space. It wasn't the majority story of the history of the Irish, for sure, but it is a story of Ireland, and it's just getting a voice now.
when I mentioned my grandfather being in Ireland in the 1940s and 1950s and him choosing to go to Dublin after originally going to Edinburgh because there weren't enough Black people there, and he found out that there was this kind of little cohort of Nigerian students in Dublin, so Dublin seemed like a more diverse option for him. I was talking about it publicly, and then somebody messaged me and they were like, yeah, there was actually like a significant Nigerian community, to the point where my parents, like Irish grocers, like sold all of this Nigerian food. And I was like, what? And then she sent me like a sign from their shop or something, and it was like food that was not available like when I was growing up in Dublin. And it really confounded kind of my ideas. So I think those stories are really there, you know, they're just not necessarily very well known.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you for coming.